Good design today typically revolves around high density, high quality photos, typically utilized in a full screen hero image. Well, sometimes you want more than just a background image. You want to also be able to do some transparency and do a color overlay. All this can be done in CSS without affecting any text that you may want on top of that image. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use HTML and CSS to do just that. Hey guys, it's Chris, the owner of Love to Dev, and today I want to do what I think is a pretty cool walkthrough some code to give you a tutorial on how to create a full screen hero image using a background technique so that you can apply some opacity without affecting a text overlay. And for good measure, we're also going to add a color overlay to apply a little color tint to it. And we're going to make this a fully responsive solution. That way smartphones don't download really large image files. So when this is all said and done, you're going to have some great code to reference for your websites to make these great, stunning, big full screen hero images. Now, the source code is available on the GitHub repository, and you can see the link in the description below. I also have a blog post that you can go through and read and reference as well, and that link is also in the description below. So make sure that you take the time to like the video so that you can come back and reference it more often, and make sure you get to those descriptions from your device, because you may be watching this on a phone, you never know, and maybe not necessarily that easy to get to the description. Anyway, so let's get right down to it. So what I've got on the screen right here, I'm going to kind of move this out of the way a little bit and move this down so we can kind of see where we're going, is I've got our final product. And right now, the width is about half my screen, so it's triggering some breakpoints that we're going to cover in this tutorial. But I've got a nice, beautiful background image that we're using. It has got a 40% opacity applied to it, so it's a little transparent. And then on top of that, we've got a purple color overlay that also has a 40% transparency setting to it, so that you can actually see the image behind it. And then on top of it, we have a absolutely centered, both horizontally and vertical text overlay. And so you're going to get a lot of different little features out of this tutorial that maybe you've been trying to solve in a lot of other places. I know this is something that when I finally got this solution working, I was super happy because I've been needing this solution for several sites in recent years. And there's a lot of what I consider hacks and legacy ways to do some of this stuff, but none of it's really good. Some of it involves JavaScript, and you definitely don't want to use JavaScript. This is pure HTML and CSS, so it's going to render very efficiently and not be a performance bottleneck for you. So without further ado, let's just look at what we've got in the markup. Now, as I roll over this, the left side is going to kind of highlight what element we're looking at. And so the main thing is our hero element, and this is designed to be full screen. Okay, and so it actually starts even above that. So we're going to go, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to our sources, and we're going to just move this over and move that down so we get a little more view space. What I've done is I've got a single HTML page with all the code necessary for this. Well, the images are external, but that goes without saying. And I've inlined the styles. So to start off with, I just added a quick little basic CSS reset to make sure that all of our margins and padding are set to 0. And then the HTML and body elements are designed to be the full viewable screen, so that at least the page is the size of the screen or the viewport of the browser. And this is just a basic CSS reset. If you're using Bootstrap or Materialize or some other CSS library or framework, they will generally have a more robust reset in place that'll most likely have these same settings there. But I did want to point this out because without this, this may not necessarily work as desired, but this should be a pretty standard thing that most sites have these days. Next is our main hero element. Let me go back, or go now, actually I'll just go down to our markup and we can review it. Okay, so we've got a hero element, and this is where all of the big hero image magic will happen, is off of this particular element. And then inside of that element is the text overlay. If I go over here to the elements panel, you can see that that's going to be the whole thing, and that's just going to be the text overlay. And within the text overlay, we've got a couple of heading H1 and H2 tags just to hold the text, and we'll get to those in a little bit. But let's start off with our hero here. Now we'll come back to this flex center in a little bit. We want to look at the actual hero here, and I've just added some dimension stuff here with the height and width, making that 100%. Notice I also set the min width and heights to be 100%, just to make sure that the element does fill all of the available space, which in this case is going to be the actual viewport. That way this is a full-size image and everything. Next, I set the position relative just to make sure that it lines up. If we take this off, I think we get a little bounce in it. No, actually we don't, but I think it's kind of a safekeeping thing. It also helps work on some of the centering here that we'll look at a little bit later on. Obviously that didn't affect anything, but I think it's just good practice to do that. And you can see there's our reset. Now, notice there's nothing with the markup and the CSS at this level to reference our actual big image that's back there in the background. And that's because this solution is going to take advantage of pseudo elements. If you haven't heard of pseudo elements, they've been around for a few years, and this is kind of a nice secretive way to do some kind of more advanced layout techniques. If you followed along in the CSS shapes video or blog post, you know that you can create a lot of really cool shapes with transforms and border radius tricks, but some of the stuff utilizes these pseudo elements to transform and move those around. For example, I created stars and heart and some other things with the pseudo elements. So that's what we're going to do here as well. And the reason why is because we want to be able to apply opacity to our hero background image, and we don't want that opacity to affect the overlaid text. That's because there is no background opacity property in CSS. But if you apply opacity to an element, not only does it affect the opacity of that particular element, but it would also affect all the child elements. And since our text is a child element of the main hero element, if we applied opacity here, then we would also see the opacity of our text fade out as well. So we don't want that. And let me just take this out. So what we're going to do instead is, you see right here, I can just select the before, and that's a pseudo element. Now this element doesn't physically exist in our markup, but it does exist in the DOM, and we've got the ability to manipulate it, and we're going to be able to make this a responsive solution. I'll come back to that here in a moment. But first I want to look at how we're doing this. And because I've got a responsive thing, it's showing us that this particular property has been overridden by an additional rule, and I'll get to that here in a moment. But let's just assume that this is the one being used. This is how we're going to reference our background image, and that's just a standard background-image selector. Now, I do encourage you not to just throw background in there with a bunch of the property set. It's a lot better practice to explicitly set individual properties. It makes doing responsive design a lot easier because if you're going to override those properties, as soon as you override like one of those properties, it's going to kind of kludge up the rest of the stuff, especially if the descendant or the last ones that are applied would use just background. Then it would just wipe out any individual thing. So it's a better practice to do individual properties like this. So that's why we got the individual image here. And next is the background size. We're choosing cover because that causes the browser to render that background image so that it fills all of the entire space. Now, it's not going to try to change the aspect ratio of the image. What it's going to do is going to make it match up as best as it can. And in this case, we've got pretty much of a square visual here, but the actual image is basically a 12 by 9. I think it's 1920 by 1200 or something like that is the original image. I can't remember what the actual original dimensions are, but that's okay. We'll see that later on, I guess. But anyway, so basically it's going to pick the best one so that it's going to stretch it out. We'll see if I actually change that, say move down, you'll see that the fruit or the vegetable, the food, whatever, starts kind of moving out of the picture. And that's because it's kind of trying to keep the aspect ratio set so that the image doesn't like become distorted. Okay, so that's really what's going on. Okay, now in Pseudo Elements we have the content property, and this allows you to actually drop in text, and you could also even drop in a reference to an image and a few other kind of hacky tricks. I'm not really worried about that in this case, but I do encourage you to set this to empty. I have found that if I don't set this property, some of the other things don't necessarily work as intended. As you can see right there, that really kind of messed everything up and actually took out the whole element. So you do need to set the content property on the element. Let me just go back here. There we go. Inspect. And we'll expand this back out and choose before. So you definitely want to set the content property. Next, we'll make it a block display, and we're going to choose absolute positioning, and we're going to make it fit on the top left, and we're going to make it a full 100% to make it take up all the available space. Now, if I take this out, the background image gets a lot wonky and it actually becomes kind of one of the things right there. But as soon as we make it absolute, it allows us to start positioning it a little more explicitly, and that's what we're after. Next, I set the z-index to -2. That's going to push it all the way back. And I set it to -2, say, instead of -1, because later on, we're going to put that color overlay, and we'll set that one to -1 to make sure that it is on top of the image. So for now, it's -2. If you wanted to say -9999, feel free. You basically get the same kind of effect. Now, last but not least, we're going to set the opacity to 0.4. And the reason why we're doing that is because I really want to show all the different tricks you can do. Now, this is the key reason why we're using the pseudo element instead of the main element to set the opacity. That's because when you set the opacity on the pseudo element, it doesn't affect the main element. And that's because they're in the DOM two separate elements altogether. Now, if I take this opacity off, you can see that the image shows up at full force, and that may be what you're after. It's totally up to you. But for the demo and tutorial sake, we're going to make it semi-transparent, and that way we're going to get a little softer effect in the end. Okay, so that's how you make the image semi-transparent without affecting like the main content area. In this case, it's going to be the text overlay that we're really after. Now I'm going to move on to how we're going to do the responsive images. And if you haven't heard, there's ways to do responsive images using source set and the picture element, but because CSS naturally does responsive design through media queries, we're going to take advantage of that. Now, by default, we're using a small image, and this is because when you do responsive design, you always want to start with the smallest screen and then progressively set breakpoints in media queries to apply styles as the viewport or the screen gets larger. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume we're on the smallest screen to start off with, and so we're going to reference the smallest image that I've created, 320 by 212. And I've got an AWS Lambda routine that I've set up where I can just upload an original image, and it's going to take care of creating an array or a set of different sized versions of that image so that the image A is going to be loaded most optimally for that particular device, so that, say, a smartphone is not going to download a 3,000 pixel wide image when it can only show, say, 480 pixels wide. It's going to download the one that's going to fit best in that 480 pixels or whatever space I've given it to render in. And that means it's going to take up a lot less bandwidth, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, we're going to start with 320. And my script or my Lambda actually created the whole set of from the 320 all the way up to the full size image, and at the same time ran it through an image optimization service, so that now the images should be relatively as small as they're going to be able to get without distorting the actual visual quality. But that's a whole nother ballgame. Just know that that's being done. And to also be helpful, it also creates a responsive image tag for me that I can use. And if you look at the actual blog post and you view the source or inspect the elements, you will see that all my more recent blog posts all use responsive images, all created through my little Lambda tool. But it also creates a responsive CSS script for me as well, so that I could literally just drop it into my code and have those available. Now, the way it works, and we'll scroll up, you can see I've got the next breakpoint is at least 320 pixels, which matches up to the width of the first image. And the next image is 460 by 305, so it gets a little bigger. The next one breakpoint is going to be 460, and that's the one we're actually using because that's the width that we have. Now, if I expand this out just a little more, you can see we're all the way up to 796. So now we've hit that 720 breakpoint, and the next image was loaded. So that's what's happening. It's going to load the most optimal image for the display that it needs at that particular moment. Now, if you're on a phone and you say rotate from portrait to landscape, then that may trigger a breakpoint. It may not trigger a breakpoint, but the browser is going to pick the best image that it needs, and it's going to just download that image instead of the whole set. And this is a neat little trick to make our background image load the right image, so we aren't downloading a 2 meg image file when we only really need 36 kilobyte image file. It's much nicer to download the smaller file, especially when somebody's on a cellular connection, than it is to download the big fat one. So that's a good trick to know, and you can take that one home with you and apply that to a lot of different places. Okay, so before we go to our color overlay, I want to talk about doing the text. Now, on our main hero image, we have the flex center, and this is just a little helper CSS rule that I created, CSS class if you will. And what we're going to do is we're going to use flexbox. So I set the hero elements display to flex, and this allows me to do a lot of cool things to manipulate the layout. Now, if you're not familiar with flexbox, and let's say CSS Grid for that matter, these are great new broadly supported layout sets that you can use to more easily control how your content is rendered. Now, in this case, I want to make sure that the child elements of the flex box element here, which is our main hero image, are lined up perfectly centered. Now, to do that, the main two properties are this justify content and align content. And this is telling the browser that we want to center the child elements horizontally and vertically. One controls the x-axis, one controls the y-axis, and then for good measure, I set the flex direction to column. That means that all the child elements will line up vertically stacked rather than the default, which is left to right. So they're going to do top down in this case. Now, there's a lot of other things we can do to Flexbox, and I do hopefully plan on posting some tutorials on using Flexbox sometime in the next month or two. We'll see how the time allots itself, but fantastic way to control layout, and that's how we're going to get this perfectly centered. Now, if I undock our tools here and we go to a full size screen, notice that we also have some responsive pieces in play here, and our text overlay is physically centered, and because I've got some responsive stuff, it also kind of resizes so that it doesn't take the full width of the screen. And That's because the larger screens, it's going to look a little better just having that buffer around it, that margin around it. Whereas on the smaller screens, I don't have as much space. So I want my text to definitely stand out. You could classify that under the area of, say, art direction. And this is one of the nice things about using responsive design is that you can apply different rules based on different viewports and screen sizes. So if we go down here to our hero message, which is our child element that actually wraps the text elements, this is the one that's going to actually control not only the positioning, but the actual size that we're using to kind of put that little background behind the text. And I do that, it's kind of a normal trick just to make the text a little more legible. This works great when you are putting it on top of an image like we're doing here, because the image can be kind of busy and you want to have some sort of contrast between the text and that busy background image. Now the image I've chosen for this particular one isn't the worst as being busy, but I still want to show you some techniques here. So again, I've got a breakpoint set at 1024, and that's where we're going to drop down to make the width at 50%. And then the other stuff is basically just setting the colors, and we're also making the position relative. Just helps the positioning aspect of things. Now, how did I get the color background? Well, the same technique that we did to make our background image a little opaque is I used the before pseudo element. This time, instead of a background image, I chose a background color, and again made the Z index behind the actual text layer, set it to -1 in this case, made the display a block, set the position to absolute, and that allows it to actually, and then we also set the width and height, and we make it match up more or less to the parent element. Now, one thing I did have to do was set the margin left to 25% on this particular one. I'm still kind of troubleshooting why I had to do that. I felt like it should have lined up with the parent element, but I think there's a little disconnect in some of the things that I kind of learned and what the reality is. So I am looking into that. So pay attention to the blog post, because once I figure it out, I'll update the blog post with the latest content on this one. But for now, this works, and that's how I keep the background in line with the actual text wrapper. So again, just using a pseudo element, another fantastic way to leverage these so you can do some pretty cool effects. All right, last thing before we go, I want to make sure you know how to do a nice color overlay, because this is kind of a cool way to do some artistic design to make your hero images or whatever stand out above the crowd. Now, CSS does have the concept of filtering, and I could have applied some filters here, but the filter that I wanted really was just a color, and there's not a color filter per se. I think there might be a way to do some fancy mathematical filtering of stuff, but I didn't want to mess with that. It's just, you know, too much work. But there are filters to do, you know, black and white, grayscale kind of things. There are sepia and a bunch of other like things you can do that are pretty cool. In fact, this is how Instagram actually started. The filters that you apply on Instagram is actually, originally at least, was a hybrid application using web technology to do the filtering, and that was all kind of faux stuff while the server was actually doing the image manipulation behind the scenes. But that's neither here nor there, just to let you know that that was there. Let's look at this. I'm going to use another pseudo element. This time, we're going to use the after pseudo element. And I chose purple, and this purple is the actual bootstrap purple, if you want to have a good reference on it. And basically did the same thing we did with the hero image. Made an opacity of 40%. The only difference is I set the Z index to -1. That way I made sure that the purple overlay was on top of our background image. And that's all there is to it, really. And that's how we get our background color. Now, if I say took this off and took that off, and we roll back, you can see that we've got the regular image with the slight opacity. That also looks good. But if you wanted to, say, theme it up with your site's color scheme in this case, then you could do this color overlay. And so this is a nice little trick that allows you to just take it up another level, okay? So I hope this has been helpful to you. Again, the source code is available on the GitHub repo it's got the link in the description below. You can also read the accompanying blog post, link also in the description below. If you think this is a cool tutorial, give me a big thumbs up down there, share it with a friend, and if you think this is helpful, I got other tutorials, especially around progressive web applications, service workers, and all kinds of web development stuff. And you may want to subscribe to the channel. That way you never lose track of any of these, and you can also be alerted when I post new updates on the channel. Thanks a lot. If you got questions or comments, please leave those down below as well, and I will interact with you as soon as I possibly can. Thanks a lot, and again, I just hope this is very helpful for you, and you can get some good, valuable use out of this technique tutorial and reference the code as a template for your hero image designs.